In the early decades of the 20th century, a movement swept across the United States that would forever stain its history. Under the guise of progress and science, it was the eugenics movement, an ideology rooted in the belief that society could be improved by controlling who was allowed to reproduce, behind carefully constructed arguments of health, morality, and the public good. This movement justified one of the darkest programs of state-sanctioned cruelty in modern America: forced sterilization. Between the early 1900s and the 1970s, tens of thousands of men, women, and even children were sterilized without consent. They were often the poor, the disabled, or members of racial and ethnic minorities, those whom society deemed unfit to have children. At first, the idea of eugenics was presented as cutting-edge science. Prominent academics, politicians, and doctors embraced it, claiming it would prevent poverty, crime, and mental illness. They spoke of building a stronger, purer society by ensuring that only the fit would pass on their genes. In practice, this ideology became a justification for systematic abuse. Cloaked in the language of medical necessity, state legislatures across the country began passing sterilization laws, often giving institutions like hospitals, prisons, and mental asylums the authority to decide who should be sterilized. There was no need for consent. Those targeted had no meaningful chance to refuse. For the victims, the experience was devastating. Many were not even told what was happening to them until it was too late. Women were taken into operating rooms under the pretense of an appendectomy or another routine procedure, only to wake up sterilized. Men were sometimes subjected to vasectomies without explanation, while children in state institutions were deemed mentally defective and sterilized before reaching adulthood. This was not a handful of isolated cases, it was a widespread, government-approved policy that affected people across the nation. North Carolina, California, and Virginia became some of the most infamous states for these practices. In California alone, over 20,000 sterilizations were performed under eugenics laws, with Hispanic and Black women disproportionately targeted. Many of them were patients in state hospitals or prisons, labeled as immoral, promiscuous, or simply undesirable. North Carolina's program was even more aggressive, giving social workers the power to recommend sterilization for families receiving welfare. Poor mothers, in particular, were told that if they wanted to keep receiving assistance for their children, they had to submit to sterilization. It was coercion masquerading as choice. The stories of individual victims reveal the cruelty behind the statistics. There were young girls, barely teenagers, told they were going in for routine medical care, only to find out years later they had been robbed of the ability to have children. There were women institutionalized for minor behavioral issues or simply for being poor, branded feeble-minded by a system eager to reduce their numbers. Men in prisons were offered sterilization as a condition for early release, turning the procedure into a weapon of manipulation. And there were children, some as young as 10, sterilized under the claim that they could never grow into responsible adults. Perhaps most disturbing was how deeply respected figures in American society endorsed these acts. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, in the infamous 1927 case Buck v. Bell, upheld Virginia's sterilization law with chilling words, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." That ruling legitimized sterilization laws across the nation, giving legal cover to decades of abuse. For Carrie Buck, the young woman at the center of the case, the decision sealed her fate. Declared feeble-minded because she was the foster child of a poor family and had been raped by her foster father, she became the test subject for sterilization laws. She was sterilized against her will, and her tragic case became the precedent that allowed thousands of others to suffer the same fate. The reach of eugenics in America did not end with the courtroom. It spread into schools, where children were taught about the dangers of the unfit breeding. It spread into immigration policy, as lawmakers argued that certain groups should be kept out of the country to protect the nation's genetic health. It spread into public health campaigns, which encouraged sterilization as a way of saving taxpayer money by preventing welfare dependency. This was not fringe science, it was mainstream policy, reinforced by leaders who framed it as an act of progress and compassion. But behind the rhetoric lay a system of dehumanization. Victims were stripped of autonomy and dignity, reduced to subjects of social engineering. For many, the psychological damage lasted a lifetime. Women who later married discovered they could never bear children. Men felt emasculated, robbed of their future families. Survivors spoke of betrayal and shame, some not even learning they had been sterilized until years later when they tried to start a family. The scars went far beyond the surgical cuts. They were wounds to identity, culture, and community. By the mid-20th century, whispers of doubt about the morality of eugenics began to surface, especially as news spread of how Nazi Germany had taken the ideology to horrific extremes. What few Americans realized at the time was that the Nazis had looked to the United States for inspiration. Germany's sterilization laws were modeled in part after those already in place in the U.S. While Americans were horrified by the Nazi programs of extermination and sterilization, many failed to see that their own country had been practicing similar policies for decades. Even as international condemnation grew, sterilization programs continued in the United States well into the 1960s and 1970s. Poor women, especially women of color, were still being sterilized without informed consent. Native American women, for example, were targeted by federal health programs, with thousands sterilized without their knowledge. In some cases, women were asked to sign forms while in labor or under the influence of medication, hardly in a position to give real consent. Others were told outright lies that the procedure could be reversed, or that it was the only way to continue receiving medical care or welfare benefits. This hidden history reflects how deeply cruelty can embed itself when disguised as science. It was not presented as torture, yet it was a form of torture all the same. To take away someone's ability to have children without their knowledge or against their will is to rob them of a fundamental human right. It is an act that destroys futures, families, and identities. For decades, the victims had no voice, silenced by a system that claimed to know what was best for them. The sterilization programs did not slow down after their initial wave in the 1910s and 1920s. Instead, they grew stronger, emboldened by court decisions that legitimized the practice. In 1927, the United States Supreme Court issued a ruling in Buck v. Bell, a case that would haunt the country for generations. Carrie Buck, a young institutionalized woman in Virginia, had been declared feeble-minded after being placed in foster care and allegedly raped by her foster father. Rather than protect her, the state chose to label her as genetically inferior when Virginia sought to sterilize her. The case was challenged all the way to the Supreme Court. In a devastating decision, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes delivered the majority opinion, writing the infamous words, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." With that, forced sterilization was cemented as constitutional law in the United States. This ruling opened the floodgates across the country. State-run hospitals and institutions began sterilizing tens of thousands of men and women without their knowledge or consent. The justifications varied: poverty, low intelligence, mental illness, epilepsy, promiscuity, but the underlying motive was the same: to prevent those deemed unfit from having children. The victims were often poor, voiceless, and powerless to resist. Immigrant communities, Native Americans, and African Americans were disproportionately targeted, their bodies used as battlegrounds for a government experiment in social engineering. In North Carolina, officials sterilized girls as young as 12 if they were thought to be unruly or dissexual. In California, which carried out more procedures than any other state, Mexican American women were often singled out under the guise of protecting society from poverty and crime. Reports surfaced of doctors performing the surgeries without explaining what was happening, disguising them as appendectomies or routine treatments. When women later tried to start families, they discovered too late that their ability to have children had been stolen. For men, the process was no less cruel. Young men in mental institutions were subjected to vasectomies without consent, their masculinity stripped away in the name of progress. Patients who refused or resisted were threatened with punishment, isolation, or the withdrawal of basic privileges. Many victims were left with lifelong trauma, their dignity shredded by a state that considered them less than human. The rhetoric that justified these horrors was framed in the language of science, but at its core, it was prejudice cloaked in authority. Politicians and doctors argued that society had no obligation to allow the unfit to reproduce. Sterilization was described as merciful both to the individuals and to the public. Advocates claimed it reduced welfare costs, crime, and disease. But behind those cold calculations were shattered lives. Women who wanted children were told they would never be mothers. Men who dreamed of families found those dreams surgically stolen. Even more disturbing, the American eugenics movement influenced policies abroad. When Nazi Germany began drafting its racial purity laws, it cited U.S. sterilization practices as a model. German officials pointed to American states as evidence that sterilization was a legitimate tool for national improvement. What began as American experiments in social hygiene helped pave the way for atrocities on a global scale. The victims of these policies rarely had a voice. They were institutionalized, stigmatized, or silenced by poverty. Their pain did not make headlines, and their humanity was erased in official records. For decades, their suffering remained buried in archives, reduced to statistics instead of stories. By the 1940s and 1950s, some states began to scale back their programs, but others pushed forward. North Carolina in particular expanded sterilization, giving social workers the power to recommend procedures for women deemed unfit to raise children. Poverty itself became a justification, ensuring that poor black women were disproportionately targeted. As civil rights movements began to grow, so did the awareness of these abuses. Yet the sterilizations continued, often quietly, hidden behind the language of public health and family planning. It wasn't until the 1970s that the nation was forced to confront the full scale of the horror. Investigations revealed that Native American women had been sterilized by the thousands through the Indian Health Service, often without consent or through coercion. Young girls were told the procedures were reversible, or that they were being treated for unrelated illnesses. Entire communities were left devastated, their ability to carry on future generations stolen by government-sanctioned cruelty. In Los Angeles, Latina women filed lawsuits after discovering they had been sterilized during childbirth. Tricked into signing English language forms they could not read, the shockwaves spread. But justice was slow and incomplete. Even after the exposure of these practices, many states failed to officially repeal their sterilization laws until decades later. Some never issued apologies. Others offered compensation so small it could never come close to accounting for a stolen life. Survivors grew old carrying the weight of what was taken from them, their stories only slowly emerging in the public eye. This was torture disguised as medicine, cruelty written into law, and violence carried out in the name of science. And it raises the darkest question: how many of these victims still remain uncounted, their pain buried in silence?